A tēnā koutou. Tuatahi kā tū tēnei I runga I ngā whāriki o te tūwhakaeti hei tuku mihi atu ki a koutou. Me kōrero pēnei I ngā mana I ngā reo I ngā Rangatirama. Koutou I hui mai nei raro I te karanga o te kaupapa o Whānau Ora tēnei te mihi atu ki a koutou. Ki a koe te whaia, kore mimiti haere te aroha mō. Ki a koe te whaia miripika nau te karanga, kia tai mai tēnei ki te whakawhiti kōrero, ki te whakatoha whakaaro me ki e pāna ki tēnei kaupapa o te manararaunga a Māori, te manararaunga a iwi, te manararaunga a whānau. Nō reira, tēnā koutou. The clicker. So I heard the challenge this morning from Whaia Tariana, a call to actions. Hopefully this is my part that I play in that call to action around sharing this kaupapa, this kōrero of Māori Data Sovereignty. I want to ground my kōrero first with this picture. So this is taken from a hui I held earlier in the year, Māori Data Futures hui at Te Herenga Wakamarae at Victoria University. And I will start my kōrero with the same kōrero that I started at that hui by saying, this is one of our original data repositories. We have always been data warriors. And depending on your pukenga, you can translate that data into kōrero, into waiata, into haka, into information. So we should never be scared of data. This concept though, this conversation around data sovereignty has really come about because of the evolving and rapidly evolving space around digital technology, digital innovation and digital data. And so I wanted to come today to talk about this kōrero of Māori data sovereignty and how I think it, the synergies that it has with the important mahi that all of you do in Whānau Ora for whānau transformation. I want to set the scene by talking about what's happening at the global level and then bring that down to how it is a significant issue here in Aotearoa, and then share with you a couple of my thoughts on what data for transformation is. So Indigenous data sovereignty, and I've borrowed this from my colleagues in America, is about the rights of a nation to govern the collection, the ownership, and the application of its own data. People often talk about data sovereignty and state that data is subject to the laws of the nation within which it is stored. So when people talk about storing data in a cloud, effectively, that cloud is connected to a key server. And most of the clouds in this country, the servers sit in Singapore and Australia. So the data is subject to the laws of those nations. Indigenous data sovereignty states that data is subject to the laws of the nation, including tribal nations, from which it is collected. So if you take that data from us, it's subject to our laws, no matter where you store it. What is Indigenous data? Effectively, it's nearly everything, but data produced by Indigenous peoples, data about Indigenous peoples, our life ways, our customs, and the environments that we have relationships with. It's always good to keep definitions broad, particularly in this evolving space. There is a really growing global recognition around Indigenous data sovereignty, around the importance of data. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, there are actually quite a lot of connections throughout, but in particular Article 15 talks about Indigenous peoples having the right to the dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories and aspirations, which shall be appropriately reflected in education and public information. The World Health Authority commissioned a report on social determinants of health in 2008, and in there was also reference to the need for good quality data and information for Indigenous peoples. And in a couple of weeks, there's a big discussion happening in Argentina around the Indigenous or International Open Data Charter. And there's a push to get recognition for the rights of Indigenous peoples when there's a conversation about open data and who has governance over that. There is also, in terms of this growing global movement, an Indigenous-led response. So these are some of the hui that have been held around the world. The previous Open Data Summit in Madrid, an important hui at Hopu Hopu, you've always got to start at home. And then other hui around the world where there are Indigenous people, and this conversation of Indigenous data sovereignty is getting louder and louder. Led by, here in Aotearoa, we have Te Manararaunga, the Māori Data Sovereignty Network. There's the United States Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network. There is, just started up, a Australian Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network. And in this, I guess, global context of datification and increasing global dialogue around issues of data justice and data sovereignty, Indigenous people are answering and trying to stand up to the call around the importance of this for our peoples, for our whānau. Of course, it is a significant issue here in Aotearoa. As I said, we have Te Manararaunga, the Māori Data Sovereignty Network. We have iwi, we have hapū, we have whānau wanting to access our data, wanting to have possession over and more governance over what is happening with our data and the narrative that is getting put around our data. There was some discussion around the IDI, the the Integrated Data Infrastructure. So a lot of the discussion here in Aotearoa, the impetus, I guess, for speaking up louder about this for our people came from the creation of this, the Integrated Data Infrastructure. So it is a massive data set that sits at Statistics New Zealand, and effectively it's linked up a whole lot of data sets from across government. There are over 42 data sets in there. IRD information, the business frame information, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Social Development, justice information. Some of the issues, though, were this was really just a pilot project. So they really just tried to answer the how and didn't actually step back and answer why and who. So when it was first created, there were no iwi indicators in that massive data set at all. When it was first created, it was very limited in its responsiveness and its reflection of us, the treaty partners, of our communities and of our whānau. It is still extremely limited in its use for us. It's useful about us, but it is limited in its use for us. And this is, as people have mentioned, what the Social Investment Agency connect into. This is what Treasury connect into. So when previous ministers of finance get up and say, 10,000 people will cost me $6.5 billion over their lifetime, it's from this data source that they project that out. But what they don't do is use that same analysis and lens to tell us, actually, if your system and your services weren't limiting the potential of our people, then how much potential would our people be contributing to this country? If you track a whānau who come from the same place with the same characteristics, and you track them on their trajectory upwards, as opposed to just tracking people on their trajectory downwards, what then does the data tell us about why have they been successful? Why have they come from the same place? Why are they from the same whānau? Why do they have the same characteristics, but they have been successful? I suspect the answer will be the system has been the problem, and the system has cost us more than $6.5 billion over their lifetime. So Māori Data Sovereignty is concerned with protecting the rights, iwi Māori whānau rights of access to data. As was mentioned in the previous kōrero, it is extremely hard to access our data. And I will admit up front, I used to work at Statistics New Zealand for nearly 10 years, and I thought what we were doing there was amazing, and I saw the power of what you can do with data, how people can use it to inform. But then you come on the other side, and it's extremely hard to then access that data, which is actually our data. Māori Data Sovereignty is concerned with participation in this data integration activity, so linking data. Who says what data should be linked? Who do you ask permission of to link that data? So that IDI, the Integrated Data Infrastructure, is a world-leading data resource. There are not many countries, if any, in the world. New Zealand was the first to do that because they didn't ask for permission, they just did it. Other countries got stuck because they asked for permission first. But we have countries knocking on the door to get into that resource. We have a massive team of researchers in Italy who are trying to access that resource to see how useful it is. We can't even access that resource. It is extremely hard for iwi, for Māori, for whānau to access that resource, and we should be there first before anybody else. Māori Data Sovereignty is concerned with partnership and governance and ownership of data. It supports the realisation of iwi, hapū and whānau aspirations and how we use data to measure towards those aspirations. It recognises that Māori data should be subject to Māori governance. And as we've heard today, is a key mechanism for enabling self-determination and innovation. So Māori Data Sovereignty is the right of Māori to access, to use, to have governance and control over Māori data. What is Māori data? I get asked that all the time when I talk about this with government. Generally, well, broadly, it's data from us, it's data about us, and it's data about the environments that we have connection with. So in Aotearoa, New Zealand, it's everything. But why is it important? Why is it important? And I think actually the important mahi that all of you do is the why we fight to get access to data, is why we fight to get the data, the right data collected. So access and use is about transforming the lives of our people. Governance and control is to ensure the data is relevant and responsive. We get asked a lot to participate in decision-making activities, and the people on one side of the table have a whole lot of data, and we're sitting on the other side of the table with very limited amounts of data to participate in that same decision-making process. I borrowed this quote again from my colleagues from America. Sovereignty as tribal nations was given to us by the Creator. It is sacred. Data to exercise our sovereignty is also sacred. There are a couple of points, and I'm happy because I think, sort of following on from Whaia Tariana's kōrero this morning and our panel and previous speaker, I put these in because I wanted to share these important kaupapa, and these are purely Kirikowhai's bias around what is important around whānau transformation and data sovereignty. The first point I want to make is around self-determination versus state determination, and particularly when it comes to identity. So in the census, with all of its current flaws, Māori descent population, there are two Māori populations collected. The Māori descent population in 2013 census was 668,000. The Māori ethnic population was around 598,000. So the questions are essentially, the ethnic population is about cultural affiliation. The descent question, and therefore the descent population, is about ancestry biology or whakapapa. Most government data is based on the ethnic population. So people may have heard Māori make up 15% of the population. Actually, we make up more like 18% of the population. But people don't use that bigger number. One, it's probably more powerful for us to be a bit smaller. Two, you can compare us with other groups if you use the ethnic population, as opposed to recognising our particular place as tangata whenua based on whakapapa. So that's my bias about wanting to use Māori descent data more, as opposed to Māori ethnic data. And I want to mihitu te paumatakana and te pūtahitanga, because I know when they created their first profiles, population profiles, they used the descent population. My other key point that I want to make is around measuring towards our aspirations. As people have pointed out, and as many of you would know, most of the data government collects is deprivation data. And this quote here is from one of the big CEs down in government who's in charge of a lot of data. I won't say their name or their organisation. But they said in the hui that I was in, that's the data we collect, and I make no apologies for it. But if we actually want to stop measuring states of desperation and deprivation and measure towards our aspirations, then we need to move from being data providers, which many of us are, and data consumers and consuming whatever they give us, to data designers. We have to determine what is the right data for us, and we have to make sure that that gets collected. I'm going to try to quickly sum up because I think I've got not much time. But when I talk about data for transformation, I wanted to break it down into these sort of three high-level categories. So data for engagement, data for influence, and data for innovation. Data for engagement is about engagement with our whānau, not just counting how many people come through the door, but how are whānau engaging? What are the different touch points? I think that Te Tihi talked about. How are we tracking those trends, and how are we gaining insights? Are all of these engagements reactive, or are some of them proactive? Are all of these engagements negative, or are some of them positive? And as we journey along this pathway of transformation with our whānau, how does that engagement change? And how do we keep that data so we can track that trend? Data for influence. I think hearing about some of the kōrero and watching it online over the last few days, this is pretty important. Data for influence for our whānau. When you're thinking about data for influence, you've got to think about who are the decision makers. What data is going to be relevant for them, what's going to resonate with them, and what do they trust? Trust is the currency of data. I'm going to share with you this kōrero, which connects to this quote. One of the most resonating presentations I've ever done when it came to statistics was presenting to my own people, my koeke back in Te Arawa, education statistics. So I presented, and this was at the time when the Ministry of Education had just started to collect iwi statistics. So I presented some information on our NCEA results, on our ECE participation, and on our higher education learning, broken down by Ngāti Whakauwe, Tūhourangi, Pikiao. At the end of my presentation, one of our karaua got up and he made 2 points. The first point was in relation to one of the stats I'd shared, where Te Arawa women were more highly educated than Te Arawa men. And his feedback on that was, I'm not sure about that, girl. But his second point was, we get told all the time how Māori are doing and how bad they're doing. And I don't know who that is. But when I see those graphs, when I see those numbers, talking about Ngāti Pikiao, talking about Ngāti Whakauwe, talking about Tūhourangi, I know those children. They are my mokopuna, and I will do something about that. You can also use data to influence the narrative. And this, I don't know if you can see that little infographic, is just a quick reference to the Māori economy. So for a long time, there was, I think, when I worked at Statistics New Zealand, it had been going for 20 odd years, this project around Māori business statistics. And finally, Burl and Te Puni Kōkiri put out a number on the Māori economy. I think it was originally 36 billion, then revised to 42 billion. And then I think a law firm talked about it at 50 billion. I'm not sure about the validity of that. But essentially, what that data did, was it changed the narrative in our country about how much we cost to how much we contribute. And people reacted. The banks reacted. The big accounting firms reacted. So that's data for influence. And lastly, data for innovation, and innovation by our whānau. And this, I think, connects into some of the kōrero that we've heard this morning. The value of te tirohanga Māori, or our Māori lens. Our values are the lens through which we see the world. And I know that is a different lens to many of the analysts in Wellington. And unless we give our data and our information, our lens and our voice, then our stories will remain unheard and ignorance will prevail. Innovation is often talked about as doing something different. And surprisingly, context, when it comes to data, is incredibly powerful. And nobody knows our context better than us. Nobody knows the context of our whānau better than our whānau. And I think my sister was here on Monday talking about our project around Ruape'u Whānau transformation. And a lot of that innovation came from context, which is asking our whānau and speaking with our whānau, not to our whānau, but asking our whānau and speaking with them and using that context beside some of this data to create innovative solutions. So data for whānau transformation is data for engagement, data for influence, data for innovation. When I thought about coming today, I found this quote, and it resonated with me because I think this is effectively what all of you do. We're not transforming into something better or more worthy. We are transforming out of everything we are not. We are transforming into the fullness of who we truly are, who we have always been. Nō reira kia koutou ngā kaiarahi, koutou hei kawi tēnei kaupapa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.